Hello everybody, and welcome to another theory video by Zachary Graves. Today I will be covering labeling theory. Labeling theory is really interesting even in its origins because it actually started out in 1897 when Emil Durkheim released his book Suicide. But later on, as the decades passed, people like Frank Tenenbaum, George Herbert Mead, Edward Lemert, and Irving Goffman all added their little bits that kind of culminated in the 1960s when the theory really was fleshed out. And it became really popular because Howard Saul Becker released his book Outsiders, which covered it in more detail and really laid out the foundation. Labeling theory can be understood as a sort of symbolic interactionism. Now, what is symbolic interactionism? First, you have to break it down into its two parts. First, you have the symbolic element, which states that the meaning that's attached to an action, which is determined by the responses to that action, are actually a lot more important than the act itself. And then secondly, you have this interaction, which can be thought of as, deviance is an interaction between the deviant and the conventional people. It's not just an act of itself. It's this little interaction between two people. And labeling theory asks who applies the deviant label and what consequences arise from that label, not only for the people being labeled, but also for the labeler. Now the question becomes, what are those consequences, and who exactly are the labelers and the label? Well, in the real world, you have police, judges, and psychiatrists, and people like that, people of power. Those are the labelers. And then you have the labeled, who is pretty much everyone on the other side, but some people are more likely to be labeled, like the poor, black, powerless, that sort of thing. And those individuals who are labeled, they suffer a lot of negative consequences through continued deviance or secondary deviance. What this means is that they have a primary deviance, so they're their first one. Then, after they are labeled a deviant, that label tends to stick, and it affects them, and that leads to further deviance. On the flip side, you have labelers who are usually affected in a positive way. The labelers are strengthened in their allegiance to each other when somebody is labeled, because that labeling defines what is good and evil, and because the rest of the people are doing good, conventional things, they strengthen their bond while separating the evil, deviant people out from everyone else. However, as with all theories, there will be some critiques. The first critique is that labeling theory doesn't really answer the question of where deviance comes from. This is kind of a strange critique because that's really not what labeling theory is meant to do. It's not meant to ask where primary deviance originates or answer that question. Instead, it really explains where the secondary deviance comes from, which is, what it's meant to do. Another critique is that some of the research has not really supported that evidence for secondary deviance, but some also has. So the research is very inconsistent, which lets people doubt exactly how useful it is, how correct the theory might be. And the third and probably the most powerful critique is that labeling theory cannot handle hidden and powerful deviance by definition. Because these are not known to many people. These are not known to anyone except for the person who's doing them. And therefore it can't be labeled by society, so you can't really define it as a deviant act under labeling theory.